Okay, a little bit about the second midterm. You continue to do very well. The average was 92. I've never had averages quite this high, which makes me nervous. But well, good for you. I mean, yeah. So, um, and I have a feeling I'm going to get about more better grades than I ever have before, but I don't think they can fire me for that. So, it should be okay. The average was, did I say 92? And the average of the previous one was 91. So you're getting even better. So who has a joke? Anyone? You've already seen that I'm a terrible source for one of these. Someone has to have one. Come on. All right, I'll start looking mean at people. Let's see. Who's got one that haven't? Uh-oh. No, that look. So, all right. No, I got to be patient. Have you told a joke yet? Oh, you have. Okay. I'll go, unless someone else wants to jump in. You too. Excellent. But you've told one too. Oh, I misremembered. All right. Yeah.
Okay. What did Nala say to Simba in bed?
What did Nala say to Simba in bed? I better not change the word.
Yeah.
What'd she say?
Move faster, Mufasa.
Move. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I like it. Now that's going to be good for the next chapter when we talk about sexual behavior. But okay. Maybe he was worried about the episode being too short, right? It's a trade-off. Okay. So having talked about the data about sexual orientation, I gave you lots of reason to think that looking at photoacoustic emissions, digit ratios, and things like that, there's plenty of reason to believe that things that happened to you before you were born have some influence on whether once you reach 10 years of age or so and have your first crush, whether it's going to be on a female, which would suggest gynephilia, or on a male, which means that you're showing androphilia. And I think that evidence is pretty solid, and I really don't have any other way to explain those data. On the other hand, I need to emphasize that human behavior is always overdetermined, by which I mean human behavior is under so many different influences that you can never say, oh, this is the reason that person is attracted to a woman, that it's only to do with how much prenatal testosterone they had, because lots of other things come into play, including genes that we're going to talk about in a moment, and society and social mores, etc., that might, if they don't influence which sex you're attracted to, can have a big influence on how you act on or whether you act on that attraction. And so I don't want anyone to come away from this thinking that I'm suggesting that the only thing that determined whether you grew up to be androphilic or gynophilic was prenatal testosterone. I know for certain that cannot be true, right? There are just too many factors involved. And yet, on the other hand, the fact that there's any influence before you're born, I think makes what is already, to my mind, a rather mysterious process. How is it that this sexual attraction comes on us each, uncalled for, unexpected, without our conscious awareness of a decision having been made? This is sometimes referred to as an essentialist argument about sexual orientation, that your sexual orientation is somehow essential to you and not a product of socialization. It's sort of behind that same idea that people are born gay. And I just want to say, it's not, I mean, once you start looking into a suggestion of something being essential, deep inside you somehow, it starts to be somewhat murky. But I want to suggest to you one aspect of what people mean when they say that people are born gay, or what they mean when they say whether you're attracted to males or females is an essential part of you that you're not in charge of. And it's this, that decision, your brain made a decision about which sex you're going to be attracted to, right? It wasn't made in your liver, wasn't made in the pancreas. It was the brain that made the decision. But the reason it feels essentialist is that you have no conscious awareness of any of the decision-making process. And you have no control over the outcome, right? You have no conscious control of who you find attractive or who you don't. Now, I'll emphasize too, you always have control over how and whether you act on that behavior. But I think for most people, when they say that sexual attraction is an essentialist feature that a person has, whether they're attracted to men or women or both, that what they mean is that the person has no conscious awareness of ever having been involved in the decision-making process. And to me, at least, that seems like a better way of thinking about it, in that I at least find clarifying. Questions about that? Anyone? And then I got at this briefly, but I suggest, and I'm trying right now to write a book for the public that has this theme. I would suggest that who you find attractive is totally outside your control and is more or less immune to what the society around you thinks or expects or wants, right? You're attracted to whom you're attracted to. That's just all there is. On the other hand, gender roles change constantly. They change across time. They're very different across cultures. It's clear there can be more than two genders, etc. And so I would suggest to you, and we'll see if I can build a case for this. I would suggest to you that gender and gender identity, that aspect of gender identity that encompasses all the things we expect about gender, that's more socially malleable. And that you do have some control over, right? If you're in a society where people of the sex you identify with do one thing, you can decide to conform to that or to buck it, right? So those are all, anyway, questions about any of that. Okay. Well, so to get back to the multifactorial, overdetermined nature of sexual orientation, let's talk about the contribution of genes to sexual orientation. And there's a bit of a history about this that I want to share with you. I'm going to gloss over some of it because I think it's instructive. So back in 1993, there was a paper in Science, perhaps that, along with Nature, the most prestigious scientific journal in the world, that got a lot of attention and made a lot of people angry. And it came from a study that Dean Hamer had conducted. He was working at NIH at the time, where they did surveys of finding gay people, and they specifically looked for cases where there were two brothers who were both gay. And they put together pedigrees like this that suggested, so in these pedigrees, squares always indicating male, because it sticks out, and circles always indicates female because of the vagina there. Anyway, that they had the suggestion that there was a maternally derived gene that made it more likely that men would grow up to be gay. And so they found pedigrees like this that were consistent with that. And then they got lots of pairs of brothers, and they asked, if this is coming from mom, maybe it's coming from the X-chromosome that she gave to her sons. And if something on her X-chromosome made them more likely to be gay, then in those cases where both brothers were gay, we would expect that they inherited the same part of that X chromosome. Everyone get that idea? Whereas if they got two different parts of a particular X chromosome, then you wouldn't expect them both to be gay. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time looking at this or talking about it, but I just want to say that they then looked at the X chromosome in all these brothers, and they asked which parts. Remember, from recombination, you don't get the whole X chromosome, right? You get different parts of mom's X chromosome, some of which she got from her dad and some of which she got from her mom. And they found that there was one end of the X chromosome that was much more likely to be co-inherited if two brothers were gay. Everyone get the logic of that? And lo and behold, it turns out the terminology or the convention for chromosomes is there's a centromere in the middle, right? And people refer to the P end and the Q end. And that just comes from population genetics and the equations people use for that, Punnett squares and things like that. Well, and you can't make this stuff up. It turns out that it was the Q end, as in queer, of the X chromosome that was more likely to have been co-inherited when two brothers were gay. And that, in 1993, there were lots of people that thought this had to be a lie. It could not possibly be true. And Hamer got a lot of guff from people who accused him and his team of lying. And again, you have no idea how homophobic our world was, how much more homophobic it was in 1993 than it is today. But people were really angry that anyone had even asked this question. How dare they look for a gene, something you had no control over? How dare they look for a gene that might have something to do with your decision to choose to take on a homosexual lifestyle? That's the sort of thing that had people up in arms. And so people tried to, and this is just showing you, right, that this was a portion of the X chromosome that tended to be co-inherited when both brothers were gay. And it took a long time for people to find, there was at least one study that didn't replicate it and another that did. And when you put it all together, it was still pretty clear that it was true. Now, I'm skipping over all that because all that has kind of been supplanted more recently in genome-wide association studies. We haven't talked about these before in this class. So GWAS studies are ones where you look at the genomes of large groups of people and you ask, you have different traits about the individuals there, and you ask which parts of the genome tend to be associated with particular behaviors. So you have a big population, you look for everyone who's gay, and you say, what parts of the genome are often, not always, but often the same in people that have that characteristic? You could do it for anything, and it has been done for anything. The biggest successes are in medical science, where using this sort of analysis, people were able to, for example, to find a genetic cause of blindness that no one had ever noticed before, right? Oh, that gene is associated with blindness. And, so let's find out what that's up to, that sort of thing. It's been more slowly being done for behaviors, but in one recent study, almost 30 years after Hamer's study, it was again in Science, they found 5 different parts in the genome that were associated with homosexual orientation. And all put together, their statistical analysis indicated that those 5 loci accounted for about 25% of the variance in sexual orientation in the population they were studying. Which, by the way, from the point of view, from those of you who've taken neural development class with me, the idea that a handful of genes can account for a quarter of the cases of homosexuality, when I saw that, I was struck dumb. I couldn't believe they found 5 genes that had that much of an effect. I was expecting each gene would account for maybe 5% of the variance. But what really stunned me is when it was talked about in newspapers and magazines, often the headline was, "There is no gay gene." What? As if a repudiation of Hamer's saying there was a gay gene on the X chromosome. Well, I mean, what they meant is, of course there's not a gay gene. There's not a gene for being gay any more than there's a gene for being tall or a gene for being, um, for watching television, or a gene for any other trait, right? Because that's not how genes and behavior work. So what they should have been saying is there are several gay genes. And lo and behold, one of them was on the X chromosome in the area where Hamer had said there was one. So that was one of the 5. Questions about that? Good. Pardon? Yep.
Say it was like technically like 8% of variation, would that mean that like that they didn't really have like even would it still be significant?
Absolutely, but it's a great question. So let me describe more specifically what that means. What they mean is that of all the variation in sexual orientation in that population put together, that a quarter of the cases can be explained by due to these 5 genes, or maybe it's 8%. And again, in Neuroscience 416, I'll talk about it. In terms of IQ, no one has ever found any gene that accounts for more than a few percentage of variation in IQ in the population, right? So, or height. How many of you think height is probably a pretty genetically determined, right? It is. You know what? It turns out they found something like 50 different genes that have a big effect on height. And by a big effect, I mean a whole centimeter. And you put all that together, and it accounts for about 25% of the variation in height in the human population. So it's not that there's a gay gene. There's lots of gay genes, and 5 of them are really important. It's not that there's a gene for height. There's at least 50 different genes for height. And each one of them makes only a tiny contribution. And that's how genes work. The only time genes have a big effect is when they cause a defect in sensory systems, or they cause everything to go disastrously. Like, think of Huntington's or something like that. Okay. So one of the things that people said when Hamer said that there was a gene on the X chromosome that made it more likely that men would grow up to be gay was, how could there be a gene for homosexuality? Because, of course, natural selection would select against same-sex behavior, right? And you can see the rationale for that. But this reflects an incredibly naive notion of what evolution is really like and how natural selection really works. So, first of all, of course, across history, most gay people still reproduced. Until recently, fairly recently, whether you were attracted to men or women, if you were a man, you were expected to have a family. Oscar Wilde, who was almost certainly gay by any measure, he had a family, had children, apparently was a very devoted father, because that's what society expected of him. So who says gay people don't reproduce? On the other hand, of course, you could expect that gay people would not reproduce as often as straight people, right? If they're not as interested in heterosexual sex, then it's going to be hard for them to leave offspring behind. Another point that I always like to make is what makes you think that every population, the genes have been selected that really make it likely that individuals reproduce? What percentage of the population, human population, is infertile? I've mentioned this before. Anyone remember? About what proportion of the human population is infertile? 10%. Well, wait a minute. These are people that have genes that don't let them reproduce, and yet every generation, there's a group of people like that. Because natural selection does not necessarily select for the best way to make offspring. It just selects for those individuals who do leave offspring behind. And recombination means that some of those offspring are going to have combinations of genes that aren't going to work to reproduce again. So the idea that having a gene for homosexuality would make you less likely to reproduce in no way suggests there can't be genes that increase the odds of homosexuality. And then people have suggested that there may be that gay genes, right, genes that make you more likely to be gay, maybe they have other advantages. So, for example, if the same gene that makes you more likely to be gay also makes your immune system stronger, well, then that would be a way natural selection might select for that gene. Or the other idea is sometimes there's having a copy of one gene increases your chances of reproduction, whereas having two copies of that gene decreases the chance of reproduction. And the classic example is sickle cell anemia, where in places where malaria is important, having one gene for the sickle cell trait makes you less likely to succumb to malaria and therefore more likely to reproduce. And so in those populations where malaria is a factor, there's a proportion of people that are carrying that sickle cell gene. As long as they only carry one copy, they're fine. But inevitably, there'll be some children that will get both copies of the sickle cell trait, and they're the ones that are going to suffer. And for the most part, without medical intervention, they're not going to live to reproduce. So there's an example of a gene that increases your chance of reproduction with a single copy, but having two copies might make you less likely to reproduce. Questions about that so far? And then there's the question of inclusive fitness. Another thing that people have suggested is maybe if you have a gene that makes you gay, maybe you're not as likely to reproduce, but maybe you take better care of your relatives. And you think about the two-spirit people in those societies, right? Or the Papapine in Samoa. In those cases, one of the things that's quite clear is that those individuals really are looking after children and their nieces and nephews, right? That's an important part of their culture. Their role in both those cultures is to look after their nieces and nephews. Well, their nieces and nephews carry their genes. And so if a gay gene makes you more likely to help your nieces and nephews and they reproduce, then the gene's going to be propagated. And another thing, sort of along the lines of how come so many people are infertile, is you can think of a trait like colorblindness, right? So in general, it's probably not good to be unable to distinguish red from green, right? Especially if you're a fruit-eating species, etc. And yet, in our population, about 10 to 11% of men can't distinguish red from green. That doesn't mean they won't reproduce, right? But that sort of thing happens. Or, personally, myopia, right? Clearly, there are genes for short-sightedness, and there's no way that helps you to reproduce. Certainly didn't help you to reproduce in the plains of Africa, and yet our population's full of people with those. And I say this as a short, myopic, flat-footed male, right? So those are all genetic traits and they're all deleterious, and yet I managed to reproduce. Finally, there's this idea that for which there is some empirical evidence that, I'm going to skip that, that there might be a gene that when it happens in women makes them more likely to reproduce, but when it happens in men makes them more likely to be gay. And some folks thought of a very careful way, a very clever way to test that idea, which is they gathered pedigrees of gay men and straight men. Okay? And they tell me about your family. Tell me about your mother's siblings and how many children they have and things like that. And what they found was that men who are gay, there's evidence that their aunts and mother have more offspring on average than men who are straight. Everyone get the idea? So the individual we're keeping track of is gay. Let's say he never reproduces, but his mom and his mom's siblings, his mom's sisters, all, have a good chance of carrying the gene. And if they have more children, then the gene will get propagated in the next generation. So it turns out mothers of gay men produced on average 2.7 babies, whereas mothers of straight men produced 2.3. And that turned out to be statistically significant. Or you look at their maternal aunts, and the maternal aunts of gay men had 2 babies on average, whereas the maternal aunts of straight men had 1.5 babies. So that's exactly what you'd expect if there is some gene that makes it, that when it occurs in women, makes them, say, particularly androphilic, and therefore they have more children. But if it happens in the guys, it makes them more androphilic, and they might end up being gay. Doing so far, so good. And then finally, there's one more prenatal factor that we know is important for sexual orientation. In this case, only in men. I'll remind you that that when we looked at digit ratios in gay versus straight men, when you looked at all the gay men, at least, there was no difference between them and straight men, and therefore there's no evidence that they were seeing more or less prenatal testosterone in the straight men, unlike the case with lesbians. But there's another effect that's really striking. It's been seen repeatedly, and it's absolutely rock solid in terms of the data. And that is this, that when a boy is born, for every son his mother carried before him, his odds of growing up to be gay go up by 1/3. Now, the eldest son only has like a 2% chance. Okay. But second sons have a 2.6% chance. And third sons have a 3.4% chance. And the only way you see this is you look at big populations and how many older brothers do you have? What's your sexual orientation? And it turns out that oldest sons, 2% of them are gay. Second sons, 2.6. Third sons, 3.4. And notice that even though it's going up by 1/3, you got to have like a dozen older brothers just to have a 50-50 chance of being gay. So this is worthless, as with digit ratios and sexual orientation. This is worthless for telling you whether any particular boy will be gay or straight, because most third sons are straight, right? The vast majority are. So this is a statistical effect, not one that can tell you about individuals. And when I talked about this, when I go places, there'll be, for many years, people would come up to me afterwards and say, well, I have a younger brother and I'm straight, but he's gay. Do you think it's my fault that he is gay? And, the answer always is there's really no way of knowing. Odds are, your younger brother got to be gay some other way. But on the other hand, it's possible that you made the difference. And There's no effect of older sisters, no effect of younger siblings, and there's no effect like that on women. So the sexual orientation of women has nothing to do with birth order. So this is sometimes known as the fraternal birth order effect, fraternal referring to brothers, saying that the more older brothers you have, the more likely you'll grow up to be gay. And if you look at the statistics and then do the math on family size in the United States, it turns out there are about 1 million men in America today who are gay, who, if their mother had not had sons before them, they would be straight today. And keep in mind, this has nothing to do with traditional genetic inheritance, right? So I'm saying the same person, born in the same family, in the same cultural milieu, with the very same genes, would have been straight if their mom hadn't had any brothers before them. In what sense can you say a person chooses how many sons his mom had before him? Yeah. It's a great question. It only matters with how many sons mom had, not dad. And it's not a social effect in the sense that, I mean, you might think, oh, having an older brother means that he bullies you and you're more likely to take a different role in life, right? But that can't be the case because, I have this here? Because older stepbrothers make no difference on sexual orientation, and older brothers who were raised apart do. So even if the older brother, you weren't raised with that older brother, if there was an older brother there, you're more likely to be gay. Did that get to your question, Kofi? Yeah, so another great question. It turns out that miscarriages also count. So if they know that that it was going to be a boy, then that counts. And so, and it's just to show you. I mean, one way you can confirm this. We confirmed it in our digit ratio study because we asked people how many older brothers and sisters they had and how many younger brothers and sisters they had, and the only thing that mattered was the number of older brothers, and only for men. And so, for the straight people, if you tally up all the older brothers and all the older sisters, the ratio is about 105 brothers to 100 sisters, which is the population ratio at birth. But I guess they didn't put that. But for the gay men, for every 100 sisters they had 120 older brothers. And so that's where you can see that those older brothers somehow had an influence on that particular person's sexual orientation. The leading theory to describe this, which I chatted about briefly in that 60 Minutes episode, if you watched it, is the idea that there are genes in the Y chromosome that mothers never see because they have 2 X chromosomes, and therefore their immune systems never see them. And so Ray Blanchard in Toronto, he suggested that maybe there's a gene on the Y chromosome that when the baby's delivered and blood mixes, mom's immune system gets exposed to it for the first time, and she starts making antibodies to that male-specific antigen. And then when she has subsequent sons, those antibodies cross the placenta and affect that son's neural development. And there's a ready analog to this in so-called Rh factor. So, in terms of blood type, people are either Rh positive or Rh negative, and Rh positive is much more common. Before your time, if a mother was Rh negative and she carried a baby who was Rh positive, the first baby had no problem. And that's because during pregnancy, mom's blood and the baby's blood are kept strictly apart, right? The placenta exchanges gases and nutrients, but doesn't. The blood cells don't cross the placental barrier. But at birth, whether it's a vaginal delivery or cesarean, inevitably both individuals bleed. And so that's a chance when the baby's blood will get into the mother's bloodstream. And now, so the first baby carrying Rh factor, everything was fine. But at delivery, mom got exposed to this unique antigen, started making antibodies to it. Everything's fine until she has another baby that is Rh positive. And so 30 years ago, when people were alerted to this, I mean, the babies would sometimes be born and sometimes they would die because basically their blood supply wasn't working. And for many years, once this was identified, the only treatment was once the baby was born, if you knew mom was Rh negative and dad was Rh positive, and the baby was born and you could see signs of distress that its blood was to completely transfuse all of its blood. Take out all the baby's blood, which is Rh positive, and replace it with Rh negative blood until the baby can start making his own, and you've got rid of all the antibodies that mom provided him through the placenta. Everyone get that? And so this was why, people who had O negative blood type, their blood was especially prized because that would have to be used in babies who were born Rh positive factor. Nobody needs to do that anymore. Why? These days, and we'll talk about this when we talk about fertility and childbirth. These days, if the woman is Rh negative, the doctor's office knows about that right away. And whether dad is Rh positive or not, after she delivers, they will purposely inject the mother with antibodies to the Rh factor so that her immune system won't see enough of the Rh factor to make her own antibodies. Everyone get the idea? So they're going to sequester any Rh positive factors that got into her circulation by having antibodies attack it already. And then her immune system never reacts to it. And so this stuff is called ROGAM, right? So it's antibodies. I think they generate them in horses, maybe something like that. Or maybe they gather them from people. Anyway, and so when an Rh negative woman gives birth, she'll always get an injection of ROGAM afterwards. And it doesn't matter whether the dad's Rh positive or not, because, you don't necessarily know who the father is, and it's safer just to give it. And it's totally safe and easy to take care of. Well, Blanchard has suggested maybe there's something on the Y chromosome, and in a study that came out a few years ago, they found evidence that moms for which, when they looked at the pedigree, it looked like she might have been causing subsequent sons to be gay. They found that they were much more likely to carry antibodies to a very specific Y chromosome specific ligand called neurolignin 4Y. And neurolignin is a protein that's important for synapse formation. Again, in Neuroscience 416, we'll talk about the roles of neurolignin and orexin. And so it could be that when she sees neurolignin 4Y for the first time with her first son, that she makes antibodies to it, and then subsequent sons will be exposed to this antibody, and that might make the difference, perturb things just a little bit to make them more likely to be gay. Questions about that? And I think I'm gonna summarize all this, which is that homophobia in America has been reduced a lot in my lifetime. So from 1990 to 2021, you can see that the number of individuals who thought same-sex relations were always wrong went from 3/4 of the population to 1/4. And in general, for the most part, the more religious people are, the more likely they are to think that homosexuality is wrong. So people that go to some sort of worship every week are much more likely to think gay sex should be discouraged than people who don't or rarely go to church or synagogue or whatever. And there are still lots of parts of the world where it is illegal to be gay, where you can be imprisoned or sentenced to death for being gay. And I put on the D2L site, you can see in Iran these days, it is still a death sentence. It is a capital offense to be homosexual. And therefore, the Iranian government requires people who are born male, who are attracted to other males, they require them to have sex change operations. So the government requires them to become trans because this is how you get rid of homosexuality. Kind of similar to the Fa'afafine in Samoa, who think there's no such thing as, they don't know anyone who's gay because they're not gay. They are this third gender. What's the white stuff? I don't know. Like the gray areas. It's where I don't know. They didn't have the data, I guess. And those are probably places where it's not legal, but neither is it punishable. And in the United States, there are some places where there are crimes, where there are statutes on the book to make it a hate crime to target someone because of their sexual orientation. And it shakes out about as you think in terms of the association of religion and whether or not killing people because they're gay is a hate crime or just plain old crime. I'm going to skip that. Last thing I'll say on this topic is this graph that I always want to spend a little bit of time of explaining. So, again, this has gotten so much better, but in my lifetime, I can remember once in Berkeley, I'm crossing the street and some guy in a pickup truck is pretty excited and he starts yelling, homophobic slurs at all the people that are crossing the street, right? All the men that are crossing the street. And it's just, that used to be a thing that would happen, right? And the idea of two people of the same sex holding hands in public, it just didn't happen. I mean, outside of the Castro or a few other places in the world, it just didn't happen because you would be made a target right away. In much the same way that interracial couples were and sometimes still are targeted for violence. And there's an interesting study where someone suggested that maybe some of these people who are so homophobic, so kind of over the top homophobic, maybe it's because maybe they're just a little bit gay. And so in this study, they asked people their attitudes about homophobia. This was back in the, I think, late 90s, 96. And so they have a gauge of how homophobic people are. And men and then had them watch sex videos and strapped up a strain gauge to their penis to see how much of an erection they were getting. Okay? And when they showed them clips of heterosexual couples having sex, both groups got erections, right? Although maybe the homophobic males weren't quite as turned on by it. But what was interesting is when they showed them clips of two people of the same sex having sex, the non-homophobic men had very little response, but the homophobic men, on average, were aroused by that. And so this is probably another penalty or another cost of having a homophobic society, which is if you grow up in a homophobic society and you yourself have feelings that suggest that you are attracted to the same sex, one of the ways that may play out is that you may suppress that so much that you really feel like you have to be the gay, the person trying to stamp out homosexuality, right? Questions about that? Okay. So, what is considered sexually attractive is another thing, another factor that's clearly under a lot of social influence and can change across cultures. And we're going to talk about that some. But there is one factor that seems to be seen as attractive, whether in men or women and across all cultures, and that's having symmetrical faces, which is something that you may not have thought about. I mean, in most cases, if you look at people's faces closely enough, it turns out most people do not have perfectly symmetrical faces. In fact, depending on how closely you look, nobody has perfectly symmetrical faces. And what people have noticed so here's a case where these are twins, have the very same genes, and you're supposed to guess which one is more attractive. So how many think number one is the more attractive face? How many think number two? Okay, mostly number two. And, going the wrong way. And so what you can do is you can put together double left or double right for each face. And if there's a big difference, then that suggests that the left and right are different, right? Notice that there's much less of a difference between the two composites of twin number two than there is between the composites of twin number one. Twin number two has a more symmetrical face, and you saw that. You perceived that when you saw him as more attractive. Weird, huh? And here's some other examples of symmetric and asymmetric faces. And in general, people will regard the symmetric faces as being more attractive. And the other thing that we know that makes faces attractive is averageness in a strange sort of way. And this is a discovery that really came about with the advent of computers and computer imaging, things like that, and manipulation, which is you can take, here, easier just to show example. So where is it? So here is a group of 16 men. You can take their pictures and have a computer average each one of those into one composite that is an average of all 16 faces. And, these, different faces, etc. But once you take the average, there's something interesting that's going on. Number one, once you average all those faces, it's incredibly symmetrical. So one of the things that makes average faces attractive is that they are very symmetrical. And we've already seen people prize symmetry when they think about attractiveness. And what happens when you do these averages, notice the hair ends up being sort of just kind of a fuzz because you're averaging across all that. And most people would say that this guy's face is more attractive than any of those guys. Anyone want to argue otherwise? Anyone find some other face over here to be more generally attractive? Not to say what you personally, I'm really hot for men with, hair that sticks up or something like that. But what you think would be regarded. Yeah. Pardon? Second from the left, top. In your mind, he's more attractive. Wow. Okay. Well, I don't have the plumbing to evaluate men's faces anyway, I guess. So I don't know. Okay. Anyone else? I mean, I asked. So yeah, Ian, you, okay. And I want to make sure we're talking about this person. Okay. Well, clearly I'm not gay because, by the way, one of the things this points out is notice that particular person, you can see his acne scars and things like that. The other thing that makes these average faces attractive is all blemishes go away, right? Any moles or freckles or things like that. Once they get averaged out, they've been, it's like someone took sandpaper to the face and got rid of every possible, it's like they've been airbrushed to death, right? And so to go back, here are some instances of averaging women's faces. Oh, I guess I better go back some more. No, I did that. And in general, the more faces that get averaged into it, the more attractive it's seen. Which face has averaged more women's faces? Left, right, or middle? How many? Right. Yeah. So that was actually in this case, they averaged more faces. And in this case, I think they deliberately averaged faces that were already seen as attractive. And so, yeah. And let's see, just to finish up, here's an example of these 5 women, their faces averaged together. Most people would see the average as more attractive. And then if we look at one that's an average of 20 faces, it's even more attractive. And here you can see they went to the trouble to try to make, everyone's hair more or less the same or out of the way and wearing the same outfits, etc. So why is that? What's attractive about these average faces? Yeah. They're all very symmetrical. Yep. So that's one point. And all the blemishes are gone, but that's kind of superficial. Why else? What else makes them attractive? I mean, or why should you find them attractive? Yeah, good. Say it again. Center pointed faces.
So, like this person, like a combination.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So that's why they're going to be symmetrical, right? Super symmetrical, and that's kind of inevitable. And also the loss of blemishes in it. But people have asked, well, maybe we are somehow programmed to see average faces and symmetrical faces as attractive. So one idea is this idea of fluctuating asymmetry. And the idea behind it is this, that each individual, as they're growing up, we all face challenges, right? Parasites, disease, lack of nutrition, things like that. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. 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 So no. So it's a great point, which is that if the face is average, then it might indicate that there hasn't been much inbreeding. And she's pointing out how in those royal families where you were only allowed to marry other royals, there are only so many people available. And in some cases, bad genes like for hemophilia or for facial features, etc., could accumulate. There was a time Victoria had so many children. I know at some point, she had grandchildren and children in virtually every royal household in Europe, right? Yeah.
That also.
And that's the idea of behind fluctuating asymmetry. So as you're growing up and your face is getting formed, you're going to be exposed to various forces out there, perturbations. And the fluctuating asymmetry idea is that if you have really good genes, that you'll continue, your development will continue with little effect of all these perturbations, parasites, bacteria, etc. And that this is somehow indicating this person has really good genes because they grew up in the same environment I did with the same parasites, the same diseases rampant, the same food shortages, and yet their genes were still able to make a symmetrical face. And the idea being then, if you are going to reproduce with someone, you want to select someone that has good genes, because that way your children will have a better chance of survival and giving you grandchildren, and basically increasing your contribution to the next gene pool. Questions? No. Okay. So, but whether male or female, a symmetrical face is attractive. But in fact, in most cultures, what's seen as attractive in males is not at all the same as what's attractive in females. So here's another instance where they used, the website's not active anymore, but there was a time where you could take a bar and slide it along a rail to see how masculine or feminine the face would be. And these are the sorts of things you get. So in general, what's seen as attractive in men is a wide jaw and a wide mouth, a big chin, full lips are more important in females than males. Eyebrow bushiness is more important in males than females. And eye size, having really big eyes, is seen as more attractive in females. And so here they've emphasized all these things. And I don't know about you, but I find both this space and this space a little creepy. I mean, you can take it too far, right? But it's clear that these are seen as the standards for male and female beauty. And it's been pointed out that in many ways, some of these factors that are seen as attractive in women are also indicative of youth. So full lips, big eyes, this is what you see in young adults, young people, more than adults. And so, again, kind of creepy, the idea that what's attractive in women is that they look young. And so, yeah. And no, I mean, questions about that? I mean, that so far. And another factor is baby-facedness. So baby-facedness, how much fat, et cetera, there are. You can see here they've manipulated it with a computer. And there's for women, there's an optimal amount. So it turns out that D, image D here, is just about the right amount of baby-facedness. This D, people looked at it for longer and spent more time looking at it than the others. So you can have too little baby face or too much, and then, just right. And that's for females. In males, baby-facedness is not seen as attractive. I don't think I have a slide for that. But the other thing that's interesting is people have measured baby-facedness in political candidates. And in one study, looking across lots of congressional races, and whenever they were both men, the more baby-faced looking candidate lost something like 80% of the time. And so you could predict who was going to win the election by looking at the candidates' photos. Pay no attention to the issues. Yeah. Sophie. It's a great question whether you can assign scores of objective attractiveness based on the individual traits. In general, no, because it's everything matters. But what people do is you can come up with an objective measure of how attractive a particular face is, right? And the way you do this is you have lots of people look at lots of pictures and you have them rate how attractive they find each to be. And in general, there's pretty good agreement of those. And so you can then say, according to this group of raters in this culture at this time, this was seen as the more attractive. You can even quantify it about how attractive it's seen. And of course, I hasten to add, it's different whether you're asking about female faces or male faces, right? There question? And what's being buried in that are the things that I already talked about. I'll skip over that. The other point I want to make is that there's this very consistent finding that when you show people faces and ask them to rate how attractive they are, everything else being equal, mixed race faces are always seen as more attractive. So here, we're looking here, of these faces, this is the one that has been deliberately made to look Eurasian, more or less half Asian, half European. And it's consistently seen as more attractive. Now, we're not talking about, this is the only attractive one, right? It's subtle, but it's a very consistent finding. And people that advocate fluctuating asymmetry suggest that maybe this is one of the things that's happening. For one thing, to get at your point, Pramika, that that can't be that much inbreeding if it's two different ethnicities that have come together there, and so that's a consistent finding that has been used to support the idea of fluctuating asymmetry being important. It's also questions. Okay. Finally, people have asked, what makes an attractive body? And we've already talked about how in medieval Europe, women with good-sized waists were seen as more attractive than women with skinny waists that are favored right now. But Devendra Singh at University of Texas suggested that there is a commonality, which is this idea of the waist to hip ratio. So take the ratio of the circumference of the waist and divide it by the circumference of the hip. And you can ask people which is more attractive. And in general, across lots of cultures, there is this attractive ratio of 0.7 to 0.8, where the hips are just a little bit wider than the waist. So in men, you can manipulate this, and so in these cases, that 0.9 ratio is seen as more attractive. Whereas for women, and you see what I mean about it. It's different from. It has nothing to do with how heavy they are. It's just the ratio. So for men, what's attractive is 0.9. For women, it's less, that the hips need to be wider than the waist, of 0.7, 0.8, something like that. So Barbie, she has, a totally unrealistic waist to hip ratio of 0.67. But you can find people who have, been considered attractive that are having that ratio. And all that other stuff. So these are the folks that are selected as being likely to attract men to want to look at them. Questions about that? And then shoulders matter too. In general, wide shoulders are seen as masculine, and there might be times when women in the workforce would deliberately choose clothing to make them look more masculine in order to get ahead in a culture that is very hard on women. Separate from waist-hip ratio is the question of body size, or how much women weigh. And here's another example, this from the 1600s, of these were the women in Rubens' time that were seen as the goddesses, the ones that everybody wanted to marry and have sex with, etc. And this is clearly separate from waist-hip ratio. Oh, and these women all have a waist-hip ratio of close to 0.7. But this is clearly a culturally derived measure of attractiveness. And the book talks about a case where they looked at this. So in Africa, among the Zulu, in general, women are seen to be attractive if they are heavy. Waist-hip ratio matters, but in Africa, heavier women are seen as more attractive. And we're measuring it here with body mass index. And so people studied how in Britain, the attractiveness is kind of centered on a BMI of 20. And for Zulus in South Africa, the attractiveness is highest way out here with BMIs of 35 or 40, what in the United States is considered not just overweight, but obese. And you can see how in a culture where, there's sometimes problems getting enough food and things like that, that a woman who is, already has eaten well and has lots of resources on her body might be seen as more attractive and therefore more likely to have children and things like that. But what they added to this study was they then found a population of Zulus who had immigrated to Britain. And those who'd grown up in Britain noticed that they're more like the white Brits in terms of what they find attractive. They no longer find women with BMIs of 35 to be attractive. Things have changed for them. And so that's pretty good evidence that this has got to be a culturally influenced decision about what's attractive and what's not. Questions? Okay. Well, all right. I don't want to. Well, one last. And it's clear that in our culture and in many cultures, women with larger breasts are in general considered more attractive than women with smaller breasts. And there are surgeries to either make breasts larger or to make them smaller in cases where, the woman might find that they're too large for her to be comfortable for other reasons. And so among plastic surgery, breast augmentation among actresses and models is very common. And that's what's required for them to be seen as the most attractive. And, it's fine to tell someone, oh, you shouldn't do that because that's not, that's artificial or whatever. And I'm perfectly sympathetic to that. But you can't tell someone, well, you won't, if you get breast augmentation, you won't be seen as more attractive, because the truth is the person will, right? To men, at least. So, that's why it's such a popular surgery. Okay. So that's enough for now. Okay. So see you Tuesday.